Go ahead and start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 5th Social Democratic Forum. My name is Kevin McGuire, and I am the temporary organizer on behalf of the forum. Our idea is to have a regular monthly forums organized by an elected committee that serves to assist in arranging speakers and online events related to the social democratic tradition as we know it, as limited as that may be here in America. We are presently inviting others, that is you, to help form a temporary committee of board members to help oversee this project. So far, we have Mark Brazow as temporary chair, Eldon Klingon as temporary vice chair, and myself as temporary organizer, with Matt Krimpelli as board member. We want to thank Mark, Eldon, and Matt for their temporary efforts in volunteering. We will be governed by some very basic temporary bylaws involving the democratic process. And will this experiment succeed? Well, it all depends on our short and long-term efforts. And here we are again tonight. Before we begin tonight's topic, our board member, Matt Krimpelli, would like to make some opening remarks. Matt?
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you for joining us this evening, and I'm honored to be speaking to you all. My name is Matthew Krempley. I'm a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin and a fervent social democrat. I'm here today to explain to you why that is and how I see social democracy in America moving forward. Unlike as I understand many to do, I do not approach social democracy from a political lens, but rather a philosophical one. Balance is a common theme in many religious traditions, philosophies, and in science. Too much or too little of a substance may inhibit the well-being of any system, being in ethics or in nature. This principle applies in every aspect of life, perhaps most famously expressing the idea of Aristotle's golden mean, the idea that we must strive for balance and apply the appropriate amount of action in whatever situation in order to live virtuously. I believe social democracy to be that balance, the golden mean within the gradient of political ideologies. But another way, I see it as the optimization of social and economic values. It seems a reasonable hypothesis that a society reflects the values it espouses. It should be no surprise then that when a society values the free market over the well-being of individuals, people begin to live in service to an economy which does not serve them in turn. So too, when a society values collectivism over the individual, that individual lives in service of the collective at the expense of their liberty. Furthermore, when a society prioritizes the individual over its collective well-being, the suffering is amplified as the collective society is made up of individuals bound together through an infinitely complex web of causality. Social democracy stands out from ideologies nearer to the extremes, whether along an economic or social axis. It retains the right to property, the basis of capitalist principles, which, as free market proponents readily point out, drives innovation, entrepreneurism, and has dramatically increased our standard of living, albeit for some more than others. However, a garden left untended is quickly overgrown, and prudent governance is necessary to ensure its prosperity. Here, social democracy harnesses the power of capital to promote the general welfare of its population, the population without which capitalism could not exist. As a result, social democracy incorporates the socialist values of collective solidarity without abandoning the right to private property and individual liberty. The ideological perspective is rather simple in concept. Social democracy is an amalgam of capitalism and socialism, appropriating the values of each while mitigating their deficiencies, and implementing these values under a democratic governmental structure. Basic needs must be met, and the means to success must be supplied. When we have a population that is healthy, educated, fed, and housed as a matter of principle, we enable people to participate and benefit society to their greatest extent. We must allow people to try, fail, try again, and eventually succeed without the existential dread of losing everything in pursuit of their dreams. However, the practical implementation of these values is far more complicated than a simple conceptual statement. How do we adherents to these values navigate complex social, environmental, economic, and geopolitical scenarios? How do we make policies, write laws, or conceptualize structural reforms which guide us towards realization of these ideals? The only real way to gain clarity and provide answers to these questions is through debate and engagement. Popularizing social democracy in America is a necessary first step in making any sort of progress in navigating the nuances of its implementation. This is why I believe the Social Democratic Forum is crucial in furthering political progress in the US. Ask any random American what social democracy is, and very few will be able to give you any sort of definition. I experience this all the time from well-educated people. Many get it confused with democratic socialism before I explain what both are and how they are different. Therefore, I see advocacy as the primary task for social democrats in the American political sphere. Ultimately, the two-party system is a structural consequence of the American democratic apparatus, and until that reality changes, either through the introduction of ranked choice voting or proportional representation, our efforts would be better served trying to influence people rather than trying to win elections. The point is, before we talk about elections and politics, we must justify ourselves. We need to explain what social democracy is and why it is right. We need to engage with people who are only casual consumers of politics. People who know what social democracy is have already made up their minds about what they believe. We need to show that there are still nuanced positions in the world of American politics and provide people with the theoretical framing for how to analyze it. Personally, I believe that social democracy in America needs a think tank and advocacy group. We need to institutionalize our values and ideals into an organization built specifically around advocating for those values. We must not leave social democratic theory open to co-optation by socialists, democratic or otherwise, nor may we allow ourselves to be mistaken for market-worshiping neoliberals. Through big corporate funding, conservatives have multiple propaganda-generating organizations which churn out media made specifically to influence, inform, and mislead people towards conservative ideals and principles, such as the Heritage Foundation, Hoover Institution, American Enterprise Institute, etc. To be clear, I'm not saying that we ought to follow suit with disseminating deceptive information, but this method of creating and distributing information is certainly effective. To have something similar advocating for social democracy would eliminate any confusion or ambiguity concerning the ideology, mitigate any single point of failure towards popularizing the ideology or its values. It would create a space for theoretical discussion and policy generation, give younger social democrats a way to engage with the ideology either actively or passively, and generate a catalog of media which can explain the ideology, its positions, and ideals. So that's why I think this forum and its future are essential to furthering social democracy in America, and I hope to see it grow for many years to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you for your comments. We appreciate that.
Thank you, Kevin.
Our guest speaker is Carl Shusterman, a former chairman of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, Southern California chapter, also known as AILA, and served as a member of the AILA's National Board of Governors from 1988 to 1997. He has chaired numerous AILA committees, spoken at dozens of AILA conferences, and has contributed to a number of scholarly articles to AILA's publications. In addition to practicing as an immigration attorney, Carl is a frequent writer and lecturer on immigration law. His articles are numerous and have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, National Law Journal, Journal of the American Medical Association, Christian Science Monitor, The Atlantic Monthly, Variety Magazine, and numerous other publications, just to name a few. Carl has written for and been quoted extensively in leading periodicals specializing in immigration law. In addition, he has appeared on various television programs, including NBC Today's Show, CNN's Headline News, and on a wide variety of nationally syndicated radio shows. Carl has represented clients, both corporate and individual, across the United States and around the world. He has spoken at immigration conferences in over a dozen states and in Canada, Mexico, South America, Asia, and Europe. We're so thankful to have Carl join us tonight and speak. And now let's begin with tonight's topic, updating our outdated immigration system. Carl, we're ready when you are.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the invitation. I'd like to start with just a little bit of background on the history of immigration in the United States. Before the initial people coming into what became the 13 colonies were by and large from the British Isles. There were also a few 100,000 slaves from Africa that were brought into the U.S., but there were no laws at the beginning of this country's founding that restricted immigration. So all you had to do was basically show up and you were admitted to the U.S. Not to say that there wasn't resentment about new immigrant groups. Benjamin Franklin famously thought that the Germans would be unable to assimilate and they would never learn the English language. Turned out to be false. The Chinese came during the gold rush in California before it became a state, and suffered later on. In fact, the first really, I should say in 1790, the first naturalization law was passed by Congress, and it was restricted to, quote, free white men. Okay. But as far as immigration itself being restricted, that really didn't happen until the 1880s, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress. But European immigration remained unbarred. There were no reasons that Europeans couldn't come to the U.S. But starting in the 1920s, with the rise of the eugenics movement, across the political spectrum, people thought the Northern and Western Europeans were at the top of the pyramid. And if we wanted to have a good country, we should not let in people from Eastern and Southern Europe. So, the Eastern Europeans, a lot of them were Jews that were escaping from the Russian Empire. Southern Europeans, the biggest country was Italy, and they were Catholic, and the country was Protestant at that time. So in 1920, the three countries that got most of the immigration were UK, Germany, and Ireland, proving Benjamin Franklin wrong. But Irish were okay to let in finally in the 1920s, but the other groups weren't. That didn't really change until the middle of the Cold War. And in 1965, they passed an act that opened immigration to all countries in the world. But a little known part of that, in the LBJ, President Johnson was the president at that time, and the civil rights laws were passing, Medicare was passing, but somehow immigration law wasn't going anywhere, and he needed that, to make the third world countries lean to the U.S. rather than the communist side. So he called up the sponsors of the bill, and they said, well, the problem is Representative Fagan, who is the head of the Judiciary Committee or the Immigration Subcommittee, won't have hearings on the bill. So without hearings, it can't pass the House. So LBJ calls him up and says, Air Force One is going to come out to your state, and I want to get an immigration bill passed, so I want to hear your ideas. And Fagan says, sure, thanks, LBJ. And he gets on the plane with him a couple weeks later. And he says, President Johnson, this is a white country. And if this law passes, we're going to start letting in people from everywhere, And Johnson said, well, what would you change? And he said, well, it would let in 50% of the people based on their employment skills, and that could be anybody. And then it would let in 50% of the people based on family connections. And if we make it more family based, then we're going to have Europeans, because the country is very much white and black, and the black people came as slaves, and they don't know who their relatives would be in Africa. But the white people can bring people over from France, Germany, Spain, whatever. And Johnson said, great, we'll change the immigration law and put that in. You'd never know that from Johnson's speech on Ellis Island, which, said we're opening immigration to all the countries of the world. But, they had put in this mostly white parts of the law. However, Fagan wasn't much of a predictor. So in the late 60s, when people were coming into the US from, I'll call it third world countries, including my wife, who came from the Philippines, they were highly educated. They came under the employment categories. But when they became citizens, then they could sponsor their parents, their brothers and sisters, all under the family categories. The people in Europe I was a student in Europe in the late 60s, and they had free education, free healthcare. There wasn't a great incentive to come to the US where those things weren't taken care of by the government. But in these other countries around the world, there was a tremendous economic incentive to come to the US. Now, during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, the immigration laws were updated a number of times. But since the 90s, the two parties have really split on immigration in a way that, we didn't see back then. And in the, I remember going, I was in Costco one day while my wife was shopping, and Ann Coulter, who you probably heard of, she had a book called Adios America. And I just sat down to read it for free. And she was saying, and she said this absolutely. She said, the 65 immigration law was just a plot by Teddy Kennedy and liberal Democrats to bring in third world people so that the country would be Democrat forever. Fortunately, by the time I saw her book, which is in the 1990s, I went on the internet and I looked at who voted for the 65 law. For the Democrats, it was, maybe about 75% to 25% for the law. But for the Republicans, it was over 90%. So I'm not a Republican, but I would think those senators were a little smarter than to fall for a Teddy Kennedy plot to make the country permanently Democrat. And by the way, it didn't work out to be permanently Democrat. So the immigration laws haven't been updated in the last 30 years. And there is a real dichotomy between our laws of immigration and our economy. I always compare it to prohibition. There's, I don't want some drunk guy, crashing into my car. So should we prohibit drinking in the United States? Well, I have a glass of wine every once in a while, and I don't think people will abide by that. And they didn't. And, the only thing prohibition did was help the mafia be created so they could bring in illegal liquor to, big cities across or all across the United States, and they had to get rid of it. The problem is with immigration is very close to the same. People have all sorts of ideas about, I won't even get into it, but what I'd like to do is focus, most of the news focuses on the southern border and people coming across, and that is a difficult issue. But what I think that people in Congress should be able to get together on, if nothing else, is reforming the legal immigration system, this family-based system that has not been changed too much since 1965. I heard an NPR when Donald Trump was elected president, I heard an NPR person interviewing one of the largest owners of farms in the Central Valley of California. And he said, the fellow was a big Trump supporter. And he said, well, please explain this to me, because I understand 75% of the agricultural workers are undocumented. Why would, and so I imagine 75% of your workforce is undocumented. Why would you support somebody who's calling Mexicans names and wants to build a wall on the southern border? And the fellow laughed and said to him, it's not 75%, it's 100%. They're all undocumented, but Trump only wants to get rid of the bad guys. My workers are really good people and so on. He doesn't want to get rid of them. So there's a real dichotomy in the United States. I live in a neighborhood of Los Angeles near UCLA, which is my alma mater. I couldn't cut the umbilical cord. And they call it Tarantulas because maybe a third of our neighborhood is Persian, and I love Persian food. They have a lot of Persian restaurants. They have one particular restaurant where you can sit right next to the kitchen because there's just a glass window and you can see all the chefs cooking the food. And I remember I took reporters from Associated Press and Reuters in there. I said, here's the crazy thing about our immigration system. Look at all the people in the restaurant. They're mostly Persian. They love the food here. Look at the people cooking the food. Hey, they're all Latinos. And I will bet you 90% or more don't have any papers. So we're all benefiting from an economy, whether it's agriculture, whether it's restaurants, whether it's construction, taking care of our kids, that is performed by a lot of people that are undocumented. And why are they undocumented? Well, there's different reasons, but for the agricultural workers, there should be visas. You know, from 1946 to 64, there was something called the Bracero program, and these people grew the food in the United States. But when they got rid of that program in 1964, you know, most of the farm workers, or like this guy said, maybe 100% almost, are undocumented. But this is not just a problem in agriculture, it's a problem in healthcare, which I specialize in a lot of healthcare, also education, also information technology, which is, you know, one of the leading, you know, when you look at the big companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, and so on, you realize that, you know, the reason that the US leads the world, and here I am in California, which is, this state alone is the world's 5th biggest economy. Yes, it's agriculture and so on, it's medicine, but information technology is one of the big factors, Silicon Valley. So let me be more specific about what I'm talking about. So under the 65 law, each category, either of employment-based green cards, whether you're applying for your parents or your brothers and sisters, or employment-based green cards, whether you're getting a national interest waiver, immigrating yourself as a person of extraordinary ability, or most probably being immigrated through your employers who have to show that they could not find a qualified American to do your job. There is a 7% per country limitation. Well, who are the two biggest countries supplying our employment-based immigrants? They are India and China, 2 countries with populations of over 1 billion, and yet they're subject to the same 7% limitation that a tiny country like Costa Rica or Ireland or something would be subject to. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
And now the problems are really occurring. I just looked at one of my appointments for next week, and it's an Indian fellow with a master's degree in information technology. He was sponsored by his employer several years ago for a green card. It's been approved, but because of the 7% cap on India and all the rest of the countries, the waiting time for an Indian to get a green card under most of the employment categories exceeds 100 years. So he's not going to live long enough to get a green card. But why he's calling me is because his son, who's on the temporary visa with him, will be turning 21 next year. And his son has certain problems. He needs to be cared for by his family. And he's thinking, well, what are we going to do when he turns 21 and he can't stay in the United States anymore? And regrettably, there's no solution under today's laws that I have for him. I mean, certainly they have to get rid of the 7% per country cap, but that's just one of the problems. Another problem is people who are professionals who want to get temporary visas in the United States. And there's several 100,000 foreign students in the US that when they graduate, they get a year, it's called OPT, optional practical training. But after that year, they have to get something called an H-1B professional visa. They all find employers that want to sponsor them, but there's a limit of 85,000 people who can get it every year. Last year, the number of applications, 750,000. So your chances are very, very small, even if you're Phi Beta Kappa and, graduate with a PhD or a master's in business administration or a doctor. So, I mean, this is really harming the US economy. Let me just talk about healthcare for a couple of minutes. We do a lot of doctors. 25% of the entire United States is classified by the Department of Health and Human Services as medically underserved, which means there's less than one primary care doctor per 3,500 people. So, if you're having a heart attack or something, you might be 100 miles away from the nearest doctor. Your chances of living are not very good. The only program that has been successful in getting doctors into these areas is a program for foreign doctors, because they either have to go back after they complete their training in the US. And by the way, they have to be trained, even if they're a doctor in another country for 20 years, they have to go through training and be a medical fellow and make, $50,000 a year and work 100 hours a week. But after they do that, they can't get a green card. They have to go back to their country for 2 years unless they work in a medically underserved area. So 90% of the doctors from foreign countries do that. But there's just not enough medical fellowships to allow more of these doctors to come into the country to take care of people in these medically underserved areas. How about nurses? The nurse shortage is not only growing, it's already in the hundreds of thousands of vacant nurse positions, but nursing can be a very tough occupation when you're in your 50s or 60s. So a lot of American nurses are leaving the profession. They don't want to be, turning over an obese patient when they're 55 years old or something. And the American nursing schools, I testified about this issue in front of the Senate in 2001, and basically nothing's changed. So the woman sitting next to me was a representative of one of the nurses' unions, and she said, "We don't need foreign nurses." Well, they had just gotten rid of temporary visas for nurses, so it takes years for the hospitals to sponsor a foreign nurse for a green card, even though she's already got a certificate showing that her English skills and her training are identical to American trained nurse. So, I'm just showing that we have the problem with school teachers, especially in inner city areas. The school districts go out and mostly to the Philippines, but other countries as well, to try to recruit teachers because they can't get enough American teachers. And certainly in information technology. So bottom line, I'll get to the end of this now. The bottom line is, just like prohibition, we need an immigration system in the US that correlates with the economy. We need probably less family-based immigration and more employment-based immigration. We need to get rid of these per-country caps. Also, I worked for the Immigration Service. I was a prosecutor, in fact, for quite a while. I worked for them in the 70s and the early 80s. And in these big bureaucracies, they're often very slow moving. So there's a limit to the number of green cards they can issue every year. But in the last couple of years have been different. But for the last 40 years that I've been doing this, there's always tens of thousands of employment-based green cards that are never given out by the end of the year. So they have to be thrown in the trash. So even if you would recapture the thrown away green cards from the last 20 years in the employment categories, that would give about 200,000 people who are waiting in line green cards. But even that's not going to be enough, because there's 500,000 to 600,000 people from India that are working in the US for employers on temporary visas, but they're in that 100-year line for green cards. So they have to do something to expand the number of green cards. And I'm enough of a pragmatist to know that they're going to have to give something to get something. You know, back when they had the last, and this was not increasing the number of green cards, this was an amnesty for illegal people in '86 when Ronald Reagan was the president. So they did two things. They gave green cards to 3 million people, but at the same time, they said to employers, you have to fill out a form and you have to show that your employees are all legal to work in the US. It was called an I-9 form. And federal inspectors may come out and inspect your I-9 forms. And if they're not done correctly, you'll pay a fine. So, you know, a lot of people thought that would solve the problem. In my view, it just created a new industry called the fraudulent documents industry. And people would go and buy things that look like green cards with their name on it and so on. A few years ago, they started something called E-Verify, where if somebody puts in a social security number and so on, the employers have to send that by email to the federal government, and they'll be notified whether it's really that person or they're just impersonating somebody. So it's a better system, but the only people that have to do E-Verify are federal contractors and certain other employers, but probably less than 10% of all employers. So, you know, just looking at some kind of compromise, I think they should expand the number of employment-based green cards and probably in return make E-Verify a mandatory system. But, you know, I'll let Congress take care of that. I'm not, I'm in my 70s. I'm not planning to run for Congress anytime soon. So why don't I stop there and throw it open for whatever questions you may have.
Okay, anyone have any questions? Mike? Let's go with Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Well, I'm a family-based immigrant. And so 35 years ago, it was fairly easy. My wife was from the US. That's how I came here. And I have a master's degree in education. Now, and I had a background in education and training in the UK. But when I came here, I thought I would enroll at a university to increase my qualifications. They wouldn't accept my qualifications. They said they didn't meet their standards. Well, I ended up getting a job eventually as like an immigrant counselor. And I was counseling Russians, Jewish people. And many of them were doctors and had excellent experience and qualifications. And they were saying it was very, very difficult for them to get hired in the fields that they had qualified in Russia. And sort of ringing a bell for me. It's okay. You have to meet the certain standards here. And I've since discovered there's a lack of consistency across the board between states. You could be highly qualified in one if you're an immigrant, you can, it's hard to get over that hurdle of meeting the standard in one state. Another state might be more acceptable, but on the other hand, it's just so inconsistent across the whole range. That needs to be resolved as well. And I ended up working in a related healthcare field, helping employers to address the workforce shortages in healthcare. And so nurses from one state had to meet the qualifications of the standards in Minnesota, and the teachers too. And it became extremely difficult for those teachers and nurses from other states to meet those qualifications. In a sense, it became a turnoff. So the problem just kept perpetuating itself with employers saying, we can't find qualified people. And the people who qualified in their other state were complaining about the fact, well, I'm not going back to school to meet that other standard. So I just wanted to raise that issue of a lack of consistency across the board when it comes to state acceptance of qualifications and standards from certain immigrant populations and from the existing people here who have the qualifications.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And, and like you, I've through the last few decades, I've had to get people over those humps in the road. California being one of the most difficult states for doctors and nurses. I'll give you a couple examples under the immigration. Well, it's not the immigration law, as you say, it's state standards. California, to get a nurse license, okay, because you have to be licensed to be a nurse, you have to have a social security number. But there's no temporary visas for most nurses. So nurses are calling me from other countries and saying, well, I can't get a California license because I can't get a social security number. I'm in another country. So, being lawyers, we have to be inventive and come up with workarounds. So, like you said, Minnesota, my grandparents are from Minnesota. So we found that Minnesota, you don't need a social security number. So the nurse will say, well, I have a job in Los Angeles. I'll say, okay, we'll get you a Minnesota license, and then we'll ask for reciprocity with California. California won't give you the license without social security, but they'll write a letter saying, you appear to be qualified, except you don't have a social security number. And we've managed to convince immigration that that's enough, because when they give them the green card, they'll be able to get social security right away. But that, it's a crazy way to have to go about it.
Yeah.
The same thing with doctors in California. There's something, they call it the Conrad program. Conrad was a senator from North Dakota, and he had to go through these federal programs to try to get waivers of that condition that the doctors, after they got trained, had to go back to their country for 2 years. He said, this is crazy. We have to, that we have to get federal agencies to do it. So he established something called the Conrad 20 program in the 90s. And it said that each state could sponsor 20 doctors on their own every year. I got involved with Senator Brownback, a Republican from very conservative guy from Kansas, but we agreed 100% on immigration issues because foreign doctors or nurses didn't really want to go to Kansas, so they had a perpetual shortage. And he asked me to write a bill, which, by the way, never got passed, but and put in mostly about nurses, but to put in provision about doctors. So I remember having a phone call with his chief of staff, and he said, what would you do? One thing that would bring more doctors. I said, well, the federal agencies aren't limited as to the number of doctors they can sponsor for these waivers, but the states can only do 20 apiece. Why don't we increase that, make it the Conrad 100 program? And I just remember him laughing at me on the phone. And he said, we move incrementally in Congress. We can't go from 20 to 100. So we settled on 40, which was a big disappointment to me. Ultimately, they compromised and did Conrad 30. And now California, being a big population state and having a huge shortage of primary care doctors, when a doctor who's a cardiologist or some kind of specialist comes to me and wants to get a waiver in California, we can't do it because they reserve those 30 spaces for primary care doctors. So there's a lot of things in the immigration law that need to be changed.
Yeah, just if I may just add another comment about the doctors from foreign countries who that I think you said the H-1/2 visa. You know, I worked closely with the Department of Public Health because the hospitals were all wanting to hire people. And so the guy I worked with there, he said, it's very, you know, they only allowed a small number to come in under this visa, and that those that did had to spend, I found this odd, had to spend a year or 2 years working in a remote rural area of the state. And he said a lot of those, I mean, they completed it, but it was very difficult for them to find themselves highly qualified specialists from another country, having to work in a remote rural area of like northern Minnesota where it's freezing cold all the time, you know, just to try to make it to get the full qualification. I was kind of bemused by that.
Yeah, it's actually 3 years, not 1 year or 2 years. They have to work. So first they have to do their residency and fellowship, which might be 3 to 5 years, even if they're an experienced doctor. And then they either have to go back to their country or work 3 years in, you know, maybe in Duluth where my grandparents are from, you know, and be freezing, or, you know, some rural part of Wyoming or something like that. I mean, the basic thing is, you know, the doctors, the nurses, they don't want competition because the least competition, the higher the salaries are going to be.
Okay.
But as far as the patients and the people that need the health care, you know, we need to expand the number of doctors and nurses. And again, the nursing schools, I remember UCLA, my alma mater, a few years ago, they cut out the nursing program altogether, and then with pressure upon them, they opened it up. And I remember going over and visiting with them. I said, so in 4 years, how many nurses will get bachelor's degrees? And they were very excited. They said 50. I said, you know what? I bring in more foreign nurses a month than you're going to bring in you know, that you're going to train in 4 years. So, you know, the program really needs to be expanded, but it was never expanded. There's too much pressure on them not to do that.
Okay, Dominique, you had a question?
Yeah, it's not so much well, for the gentleman that was talking in the beginning, he was talking about a think tank that really needs to happen. But also I think we need to get down to like the basics. Is immigration important to the American people? Because the people that want to come into America, that is not Americans. That's not Americans. That's not our job to worry about. As an American, what I'm concerned about are the American people. And I understand that like this nation was founded for profit. It's been populated by immigrants. yeah, white people came here, but like you're still not from here. So just as somebody can tell a Black person go back to where you came from, anybody could tell a white person go back to where you came from, because none of us are originally from this land. As far as immigration goes, people that are from here, the natives, have every right to come back. So me personally, I don't find it a problem for people in the South to want to come back to the Americas, because this was their land to begin with. As far as people coming in from Ellis Island, we have a Statue of Liberty that says, bring your weak, you're tired, you're poor, you're downtrodden. We accepted the gift. That is literally a label that we plaster. That's something that America is known for, is taking in other cultures, because we're a supposed melting pot. But then when you get here, it used to be no Blacks, no Jews, no Mexicans, no Chinese, no this, no that, until you could be used for a certain purpose, right? So as far as working, Americans, oh, they're taking our jobs. You can't take a job. That's impossible. A job has to be given to somebody. An employer gives out jobs. They hire people. You can't just take a job. Americans are lazy. Nobody wants to work outside. With COVID and everything, they're hiring signs everywhere. I've seen multiple signs on stores talking about how they're closing on this time and this day because there's a labor shortage. So the rhetoric of they're taking our jobs is just like complete bullcrap. And Americans are causing that issue for themselves. If Americans are not going to do certain jobs, we need somebody to do them. It's also a vested interest for when there are highly qualified foreigners that, you know, are already doctors. They have to go back to school whenever they come into America. Yeah, there's not going to be a lot of people hired because, like, mainly a lot of doctors are white. It's a generational thing. Then their children become doctors and their grandchildren become doctors. So like one of the gentlemen said, yeah, it's a protected field. They're not going to want to hire themselves out of that field. So that's why it's taking a long time for, you know, people to come over and get into those positions. There's a lot of problems. And I appreciate like us getting together and talking about it, but like at this point, it's like, what are we going to do about it? People have an issue with all the immigrants in New York City. Okay, and my boyfriend is from Nigeria, and he literally told me that there's a lottery for people to come over here. And I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, there's literally a lottery. Random people win a lottery to come over to America. But yet we have all these politicians talking about like how bad, you know, the crisis is. But is it that bad? Because this is the thing. It's so difficult for skilled, educated people to come to America, yet the borders are being overrun with people that aren't skilled. So like, what does that mean? Why is it that we're being like overburdened with people that have like nothing to offer, pretty much except for being hired as the cheapest labor you could ever get? Like the other gentleman said, almost 100% no papers. That means they're not getting health care. That means that they're not getting retirement plans. They're not getting the necessary things to make a decent living in this country. So there's so many problems that us as Americans have to fix. And I think it comes down to, do we want people here or don't we? Are we going to secure the borders or are we not? We can't keep going back and forth with, oh, let's build the wall. Then the next 4 years, somebody wants to take it down. Then the next 8 years, somebody wants to build it up. Then the next following 4 years, somebody wants to take it down. Like, it just comes down to like bipartisanship and us meeting in the middle and actually talking about things that matter But this is, and we have a housing crisis and a job crisis for Americans. So as far as like priority for other people coming into this country, like that's second. That's not a priority for me as an American. That's not a priority. Other people wanting to come over here and take up our resources and things of that nature is not something that I look forward to, because we can't even take care of our own people, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but that's just where we are. We have homeless veterans. We are literally opening up hotels for people that haven't paid taxes in their lives to the American government, yet we have people that have fallen on hard times that are out on the streets, and we're not housing them. That's a problem. When we prioritize other people instead of Americans, that's a problem. And I'm not trying to get hype, and I'm not trying to like be disrespectful, but like these are just things that I've been thinking about, and I'm just throwing it out there. I'm done.
Yeah,
Okay, well, thank you. WeCheck, you have a question?
I'll be real quick. I kind of got a couple of things. I know there are a couple of loopholes that help foreigners, like Canada. I know a lot of people go to Canada to become citizens, and they come over to the U.S. very easily. But, I spent a lot of time in Central America, and I know companies like the old United Fruit Company, La Quinta de Bananas, Gold Bananas, they pay those workers $3 a day. When they no longer can work, they throw them off, and they either they're too old to work or they're crippled. They steal boxes and they steal bananas to live. So when they come over to America, they hire them, and guess what happens? They pay them low wages, no medical. They avoid taxes. Why don't we go after the employers? Why don't we take their children away and throw their kids in the ocean there? But and they were during the Brazil program, they sent a lot of Mexicans back. And during World War II, they sent a lot of Mexicans back, but they sent thousands of Mexican Americans back that were American citizens. They just sent them back anyway. And so what? We just got a country that's founded on greed, and that's our Achilles heels. And then I hear a lot of the evangelical Christians say, it's the law, it's the law. Well, this country's like 200 years old, and you talked about love your neighbor, you talked about humanity, but don't bring them here. So, we got a dichotomy there. Most of those evangelicals, they're Republicans, and they don't want them here. But they say, oh, we're Christians, we want to help the people. They don't want to help nobody. And that's just a fact. I hate to say it, but, it is what it is. And most Republicans, I will tell you, and I hate to say this, but if you're a hater, guess what? You ain't a Democrat. More likely you're a Republican. And just what it is. You don't have those hate groups in the Democratic Party. You have them in the Republican Party. And anyway, that's just my little comment.
Okay, well, thank you. Matt, you had a question?
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to thinking about what Dominique was saying, with why should we care about people who are coming here instead of prioritizing, our own citizens who are already here and already in trouble. I think it's really important to think about the amount of disruption that's been caused by American foreign policy and foreign policy from all countries around the world, especially during the Cold War. There was a lot of undermining of governments who, Iran is a great example of, hey, they were about to establish a democratic government, but it wasn't completely aligned with American interests. And so we decided to reinstate the Shah through subversive means. And this happened throughout Latin America. It happened in the Middle East. And all of these consequences we're seeing now of all that disruption. People's lives were overturned. Years of war were caused by this. And there's still a lot of autocratic states, such as in Nicaragua. And just a lot of turmoil that's been caused from international geopolitics, right? So I don't think that it's fair necessarily to shut ourselves off from that harm that's been caused just because there's also harm that's being, inflicted on our own citizens. So we have to look at this from a humanistic standpoint, and not, try to draw lines around things when we're not incorporating the history into that. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Anyone else?
I wanted to make a comment regarding education and bringing educated immigrants in. I work in tech, and my husband and I have a friend. I definitely sympathize with the struggle. He's Indian. He's been in here for a long time. He wanted to get his visa, but he ended up having to move to Canada, where his wife's from, in order to qualify. And certainly, I know people that have lived here for a long time. Their children, this is the only culture they know, and so when it becomes difficult for them, it's a hardship if there's insecurity with their job. There's a fear of having to be sent back, and of course the more humanistic aspect would be to understand their conditions, but they own a house, they've contributed to this culture, they're like, again, their children don't know, anything about the country that their parents are from, and so I absolutely, empathize with that. I also have a friend who her coworker is from Ethiopia. He was a doctor over there, and same situation where he doesn't qualify that you were talking about. And so now, in addition to working many hours to, care for his family, he has to try to go back to school. And, in the very least, if they didn't think his program qualified, there should be some sort of express way for him to do that. So just bringing in some of the humanistic elements of it, people that I know that have struggled with this. But in addition, on the other end, of course, we have a younger generation, Gen Z, that, there is a reduction in enrollment in college. And the reason why is because you have to take on lots of debt. Like my sister, she's in that generation. She doesn't plan on going to college. She has to take out a lot of debt. She would have to work full time. I mean, I had to do that as well while going to school, so you don't learn as much, and she's not guaranteed a job. And so, I can also understand why it's difficult for people that are here, just seeing this conversation about, bringing in more immigrants that are qualified when they don't even have the opportunity necessarily to get those qualifications. So, the argument goes both ends on that. And then my last one was actually a question, which is about conversation around legislation for visas for like the low income migrant workers or workers that are unfortunately paid under the table. They can come over here illegally. Are there lobbyists out there that are incentivized to keep the system as it is because they don't have to maybe pay a particular wage, or they don't have to have certain safety, they don't have to provide certain benefits? And I didn't know if that was a part of the conversation at all, unfortunately, and I was curious.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of entrenched interests, that help to keep immigration laws from being passed. But, unfortunately, I have to admit, even somebody who's a liberal like me sees that a lot of the unions are anti-immigrant. I mentioned the laws in the 20s that that was the first time they restricted immigration from Europe, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe. And, there wasn't a CIO, but the AFL totally supported that legislation. And Samuel Gompers, who is an immigrant from the UK, he was the head of the AFL, but that did not keep him from, he did not oppose that legislation. So, yeah, it's complicated now, but there are a lot of anti-immigrant forces. Senator Cotton from, if you've heard of him, from Alabama, and Senator Perdue, who used to be one of Georgia's senators, they had introduced a bill during the Trump administration that would have cut legal immigration in half. Fortunately, that never went anywhere, but I think at this point, the the needs of American citizens who need healthcare, who need education, who need agricultural products would be served by increasing immigration.
I just want to say the reason why there's not legislation is because American people are suffering. American people, you don't really have insurance unless you have a job. Sometimes you don't even qualify for your own state's Medicaid, Medicare. Like I said, the housing crisis, all these things. Why would someone who's dealing with that want to fight for someone else? Someone else's rights, someone else's benefits. And that plays into the dislikement of other people coming into the country, because usually, I'm not going to say all the time, but the qualified people are educated, which means that they have funds, which means that when they move here, they can probably buy a house, which means that when they move here, they could probably buy like a car. Whereas the average American is doing what? Fighting for a living wage, fighting for not having to rely on the government to supplement their income when they're already working. And like on an airplane, you have to secure your safety before you can help anybody else. That goes for anything in life. You can't expect to help someone else when you're also struggling. So the reason why there are low wage workers out in the fields that are typically Hispanic or some other culture besides Black or white is because the middle class is deteriorating. There's companies are always trying to take away workers' rights. I worked at LG, which, oh my God, LG, like, you just by the name, you think they were something. They take away bathroom breaks on the assembly line. Okay? Like paying $14 an hour full time. Like for adults, for people in their 50s. But on the inside, it looks like Star Trek. You got little robots roaming around the floor, moving things here, there, and everywhere, and that's all they can pay. But the people that are running it are Korean, who have on nice clothes, who run the factory. So my feelings for people coming into this country before Americans getting what they need as far as like not worrying about Social Security, not worrying about Medicaid, Medicare, not worrying about governmental assistance to a point where you're able to get off of it, which leads into being able to afford life because you are paid a wage. Nobody's saying that we want yachts, a house to live in, food to eat and feed your family. So until that happens, people coming in, it's going to be the way it is, because you can't not serve yourself, but then you can't take food out of your mouth to help somebody else when you don't have food to share.
Let's hear from Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I just push back a little bit. I can understand the sentiment that Dominique is raising here with this whole question on immigration. First of all, I would say you have more in common with immigrants than we don't. I think it's very difficult for people to leave or be forced to leave their own country and come to a country that's totally foreign to them. It's basically appealing to them as a nation where there is freedom and liberty and an escape
There's
from.
not freedom because the American people have to pay for immigrants.
I know. I'm talking about immigrants. I'm talking about immigrants who come to this country.
But you say free, nothing's free. The American people have to pay for their benefits.
That's true. That's exactly true. But we have more in common with the immigrants than we realize sometimes. And I think there is a growing perception out there, and it may be because of a lack of education about the condition of immigrants who come to this country, that they're being given, and it's being played on by some politicians, especially on the right.
But when you see
that
homeless people,
the-
do you see Indian people on the streets? Do
Hang
you
on
see
a
Hispanic
second.
people on the streets? Do you
Let us-
see
let us
Polish
speak now.
people?
No, I don't want to, I just want to, I understand what you're saying, but I think that there's an impression being created of immigrants being privileged and some of them were privileged, come with privileged backgrounds to America already. You know, I mean, a lot of the Somali population came to America as refugees. They were disposed as a result of a coup in Somalia. Many of them actually had some wealth and they came here and they formed a strong cohort and developed politically. And that's understandable, but I think we have to counter the right wing who have been playing on people's on the oppressed people in America's fears that they're being left behind because of immigrants. You know, that's the argument that gets used. So it's a divide tactic that's being used by certain people on the right in order for those people to get power, and they're using it against immigrants to do that, to say, oh, immigrants are, you know, getting all these benefits and so on and so forth. But the whole problem is there is just, you know, the big picture is there's a lack of resources. There's a lack of a policy on equity that's fair to all people. I've raised the question of adverse impact. Who's responsible? If there's a group of immigrants coming in to a state, why should it be the state's responsibility if they don't have the resources and the opportunities to cope with this population that comes in? Surely that's a question of like, well, we need a policy to address adverse impact, and that should be a federal policy, I think. I just want to mention.
Carl, I had a question. Recently, we had the Biden's DACA program was struck down, parts of it by the Supreme Court. Could you explain some of that? What was struck down? What was the reason for striking down?
Okay, it wasn't the Supreme Court. It was the a very conservative judge in Texas, and I think Judge Hannon. The whole question about DACA, and just for people that don't know a lot about DACA, kids would come into the United States with their parents from other countries. Some of them came across the border, some came legally and overstayed the visas that were given to the families. But these kids were raised here from an early age, and a lot of them went to college, a lot of them went in, you know, to the military and so on. And starting around 2002, one thing that is bipartisan, Senator Durbin from Illinois, a Democrat, Senator Graham from South Carolina, they issued something called the DREAM Act, which would give these kids who America was their only home, English was their only language, some road so that they would eventually become citizens. That bill's been introduced every Congress for the last 20 years and never voted on, okay? So in 2012, President Obama, he went ahead and did this by executive order. It's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. We call it DACA. And if you had been in the US before, I think it was before the age of 16, if you had come before a certain time, if you had no criminal record, on and on and on, and a certain amount of education, you could apply for DACA. which did not give you a path to citizenship, but it did give you a work card, okay?
Yeah.
And the right was very opposed to that. And they said, hey, this is a matter of Congress. The president doesn't have any authority to do this. So over and over again, they've challenged this in Congress. About 2 weeks ago, the district court judge Hannon in Texas said, no, the president does not have the power to do this. But the government will appeal this to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is in Texas and Louisiana. And then I'm sure it will go up to the Supreme Court as to what to do. Right now, the judge said the people that are already on DACA, that they can stay in place. So there's a few 100,000 people that are on DACA, and they've taken a big chance because they have to put their names and addresses, employers, and everything. A lot of people didn't apply for DACA because for that reason, they were afraid that if they ever struck down DACA, they had given the government all their information and they would just deport them. So, you know, right now it's a struggle, but it is a thing that kind of makes me laugh a little bit because on the right, the anti-immigrant forces are trying to say, well, you can't do this by executive order, you need Congress. When Trump became president, he didn't get any immigration legislation passed. He did everything by executive order, whether it was the wall or the Muslim ban or everything. And then the people on the left, they challenged that and said the president doesn't have the power. So all I'm saying is, can't we get the two sides of Congress together? Because it's not that, oh, well, immigrants, they're all rich people and they're taking away jobs or something. It's that immigrants are, you know, I'm born in LA, I'll probably die in LA, right? But, you know, I look at people like my wife, who's born in a place like the Philippines, and she comes over here, looks different from the other people, speaks different languages, blah, blah, blah. Most immigrants are, you know, who share common characteristics with her. And a huge number of immigrants have started companies. We would not have a, whatever it is, 3.5% unemployment rate in this country, which is the lowest in my whole life, without all these immigrants starting companies and jobs. So, you know, I realize we have a lot of problems in the country, but to the extent that we do have employment-based immigration, we've immigrated a lot of people that have made huge breakthroughs, started Fortune 500 companies or started small restaurants, whatever it was. And the country would be in much worse economic shape than it is if we didn't have immigrants. And in fact, I just want to point out that we wouldn't be talking to each other like we are now because it was a Chinese immigrant who invented Zoom. I do all my consultations with Zoom every week. And it used to be people were crowding the LA freeways to make appointments with people like me. And I was, you know, wearing a suit and tie and driving downtown for 40 years. And now I'm talking to people all over the world. And I'm just sitting on a chair at my home right now. So, you know, and that, you know, I could talk forever about medical innovations and other things that immigrants have done. But, you know, in a sense, all Americans are immigrants. If we didn't immigrate, our parents or our grandparents immigrated.
Oh, yeah. Anybody else?
Oh, I do have a question. It should be on the comments section, but I don't know if you have heard the proposal by I think his name is Glenn Whale or Glenn called Sponsor an Immigrant Yourself. what's your thoughts on expanding the H-1B visa so individuals can hire people or sponsor people themselves rather than just companies, and also have certain exemptions from certain regulations? Do you think it makes sense, or do you think it would exploit people? Because so as I was reading the book about it, or reading a bit about proposals called in the book Radical Markets, they were the two authors were talking about how instead of trying to have only companies sponsor people, that individuals should sponsor too, and in order to make sure the businesses and the immigrants are responsible, that just like the H-1B visa, that the employer or whoever sponsors is responsible for, excuse me, responsible for the immigrants' health and making sure that all the paperwork or all the documents, if I'm right, are correct. And some people there's a criticism in, I think, Dissent magazine, in one of the progressive journals, that if you expand the H-1B visa, it sounds more kind of like, even like they said, like it sounds accidentally like indentured servitude, because the employer is responsible for the immigrant's health and making sure that the immigrant has a job. And if they don't have a job, and they may have like the right to like kind of like send back, or may not have the right, but if say the immigrant doesn't work in the country, that they can be sent back. And I heard this is similar to the H-1B visa. Do you know anything more about this? And also, is the H-1B visa currently already exploitative to the immigrants that rely on it, and also the workers that also work with the immigrant labor? Is there any way to reform it too, or is this just simply a natural like consequence, or something that just you can't change?
Good question. I hadn't heard about this proposal, but let me talk a little bit about the H-1B. When I left the government in the early 80s and went into private practice, there were no numerical limits on the number of professionals with job offers who could get, at that time it was just called an H-1 visa, and they split it. They made H-1As for nurses, H-1Bs for non-nurses. In 1995, they decided to get rid of the H-1A program for nurses, which I think was a disaster. And most of my hospital clients and most of my nurse clients would tell you that. A lot of Americans can't get adequate health care because there's shortage of doctors and nurses. I mean, this will make you laugh. Back in the early 90s, when they split the H-1A and the H-1B into two separate categories, there was a law firm, which I was part of at that time, I have to admit, and represented the modeling industry, fashion models. So they went around to all these senators, Democrats and Republicans, with one of the executives from the modeling industry, and they had already cut out nurses, but they said, we think fashion models of distinguished merit and ability should be able to get H-1B visas without college degrees. And here we are 30 years later, and fashion models can get these visas and nurses can't, which to me makes no sense whatsoever. As far as what you're saying, as far as self-sponsoring for H-1Bs without a job offer, that would seem to me to be a bit more nuanced, because to get an H-1B, you must have an employer who agrees to pay you at whatever the Labor Department says is the prevailing wage. So they can't take a professional, like a foreign student out of Harvard or something, and say, oh, we're going to pay you less than we pay the Americans. So I'm not sure if you self-sponsored, how that would work. But, I would get rid of the numerical caps. I'd also bring nurses back into the H-1B and maybe throw out the models, because that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I just don't know about self-sponsorship, because then you may end up getting paid a fraction of what the American workers are getting, and that would lower the wage structure in the US.
Yeah, it should be in the comments section in public. I even have the quote that they wrote. Have you heard of the magazine called Dissent Magazine? It's supposed to be Democratic Social. Yeah, so their criticism is that for a self-sponsorship version is that since they would force or make the immigrant have to have like a job and have to that their only employer could be either the sponsor or they would leave. That this was that this would be exploitative, and as you said, you may be worried that even if it's a good idea, that there may be a weakening in wages because the employers may want to use immigrant labor, and since there may be weaker protections, I guess. Though you do like the idea of self-sponsorship, I guess, in certain contexts. Do you think there is any other way to make sure the labor protections are stronger for the people with the H-1B visas? Because I know you talked about the numerical cap, but is there any way to make sure that the workers who are there are protected better? Do you have any particular labor law protections?
Well, I definitely think that the section of the law which requires employers to pay the prevailing wage or higher is something that should stay in the law, whether the people are employer sponsored or not. Just seems to me more logical to have the employer sponsor them. And yes, I think they should be entitled to the same labor protections as green card holders or US citizens.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, it's Dominique again. So in this group, the discussion is immigration and, just like abortion, it's going to happen, regardless if you ban it or not. Just like prohibition. You can ban alcohol, but guess what? You can make it yourself. So you can't get rid of it. Immigration. When has there been a time when a country has been self-isolated? Is that always a good thing? Will we ever build a border around the United States that prevents everyone from coming in? That's not going to happen. So, I feel like, what are the positives of immigration? Because we already know the negatives, the bad guys. Pretty much it just comes down to bad people, but how do you weed that out? When they're coming in droves and not being vetted. So what are the good things about immigration?
Okay. Yeah, so what I'm talking about today is legal immigration, and it's bringing skills to the United States, teachers, nurses, doctors, people that are helping Americans, people that are paying into the tax system, people that are creating hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs in the US, coming up with Well, I won't even get into that, but you know, the vaccines and things like that. I mean, people that are really saving lives, immigrants have an outsized role in all of these things.
But why I don't understand, like, if America is like, you know, number one in everything, in a way, yeah, it does look like, why aren't Americans qualified to do that? Why aren't Americans like 100% of the positions that foreigners want to take? That makes me feel like I've been lied to. America's not always number one in everything. Means that our school systems aren't what they've said to be. Means that college doesn't sound like what it's cracked up to be. So there are cracks in our foundation. And somehow somebody from another country that's in the third world, second world, has the ability to become educated, move to a complete different country, you know, learn a language, and be able to partake in something that it's like affirmative action, which was, you know, because of Jim Crow, which was because of slavery. Obviously, I mean, Irish people, racism, and this is going to sound wild, but like, Hitler was white and he killed Jewish people, which are also white. So how are you racist? Because when they're both in a room, they look the same. So there are certain white people that didn't want other white people here, which that's classified. Is that racism? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's just like things that are questionable, but like that leads into, okay, yeah, slavery, and you can't do this because you're Black, or in the 1920s, you can't come here and work because you're Irish. So then there are things like Jim Crow, and you can't come here because of your skin tone, and, you know, gay people, you can't do this because you're gay, and there's all these restrictions, and then we move forward. But it's like there are cracks in the system, and you have to make laws to make it fair. Then it's just like our school systems aren't doing what they should to educate enough people to fill in the positions that other people from other countries are filling. So that, I mean, maybe that's my gripe, is that how can someone from somewhere who doesn't know the language, doesn't know the culture, how can they come over here and skip 20 steps ahead and leave the homegrown American who's, you know, been here through everything, you know, been here through 9/11, been here through all the wars, been here through, you know, segregation. It's just not, like, in the end, it's not fair. And that's my point. It's not fair.
Mike, you had a question? Mike Hano, go ahead.
Thank you. This has been really valuable, this learning all these things from you guys. I wanted to respond to what Dominique was just saying. Yeah, you know, some of these immigrants are really pretty high level. They run the range. There's some people who are low life criminals, but a lot of them, hey, they're going to a country where a lot of time they don't look like most of the people. They don't speak the language. A lot of time they're coming here without family to support them, without a lot of resources. I mean, I'm here in New York City, and I live in uptown Manhattan. I went to public school throughout my time, but I went to this special public high school called Stuyvesant High School. It's one of the, you have to take a test to get in, and it's considered to be one of the most competitive high schools in the country. And I was friends with a couple of guys at Stuyvesant. They both came from Queens, and I was a bunch of people with immigrant backgrounds. But I remember two of them specifically, and they both come from Japan. And One came when he was 10 years old, and one came when he was 12 years old. And, you know, when you take the test to get into Stuyvesant High School, you're like in 8th or 9th grade. You're only 13 or 14 years old. And I remember being surprised because a big component of the exam, half of the points on the exam were what they call the verbal portion. Half was math and half was verbal. And I was very, very good in math. Even though I'm born and raised here, my verbal wasn't that great, but I did score very highly overall. These guys, I think they scored higher than me on the verbal. And they had only been here for just a few years. And I don't think they spoke English before they came here. And it's not even like Japanese is a Latin-based language. So when you're saying how do these people jump ahead? Well, they're both high-performing guys. You know, one of them went to Columbia, actually Barnard, and then George Washington Law School, and he was working here for a while. He ended up going back to Japan, though, eventually. The other one, I think he went to Princeton. He became an engineer. He might have gotten a master's, but then I think he wasn't allowed to stay here anymore, and ended up. I think he's in Germany for decades now. But these guys, number one, they got a lot of ability, and number two, they work their asses off. And some of the cultures that these people are coming from, it's not like American culture. Education and hard work are a big part of their overall values. And that's what's going on.
Yeah, and I'd like to a little bit about that. My wife is also from the Philippines. She's a chemical engineer. And I will tell you, growing up, my kids had to go to Kumon, which is a math class. If you ever go to a Kumon class, it's 80%, if not 90% Asian. And my daughter went kicking and screaming that she's now an engineering major at the Naval Academy. And I can tell you, being a member of LULAC, League of Latin American Citizens, I can name 7 or 8 Mexicans from Mexico that came to the United States, joined the military, had Medal of Honor. And right now we're fixing to honor Brigadier General AILA, and he's from Mexico, and he's a 2-star general in the Marine Corps. So they work harder, okay? They work harder. And I will tell you, growing up at 5 years old, I picked cotton, and I worked my way up, and I got 2 master's degrees. I'm a retired colonel, and I went to Notre Dame. They work harder.
Yeah, if I could chime in on a story back, this is an old one back in the 80s. I had a friend, I met her, she was naturalizing. She was from Jamaica. She was an Olympic athlete, had been in 3 different Olympics, didn't win any medals, but knew all the big athletes and introduced me to all of them, including the guys who did the Black Power salute in the 68 Olympics and so on, Tommy Smith and so on. And in addition to being a great athlete, she was a great student and had a very positive attitude. So she got her medical degree from USC here in Los Angeles, and she went out to Pasadena, which in my view was a fairly prejudiced area in Los Angeles. And she invited me to, she said, I'm going to have the opening of my office in 1984. And she was a specialist. So she was hoping that the primary care doctors in Pasadena would send clients her way. And I was a pretty new immigration attorney. I had always wanted to be a civil rights attorney. That's why I went to law school. And I said, Una, a lot of these doctors, this is kind of a prejudiced area. And, I hate to tell you, but, you're Black, you're from Jamaica. Do you think these white doctors are going to show up at your office opening and send doctors to you? And she looked at me and with just a sly smile, and she says, I thought of that, Carl. You just wait and see what happens. I get the invitation in the mail and it says, come meet, Una Morris, star of all these different Olympics and stars of, at that time, the Olympics were going on in Los Angeles in 1984, and meet stars of this Olympic. So my wife and I went out there were 100 white doctors there, and most of them went ahead and helped make Eunice practice what it became. They just wanted to meet all the stars, and I thought, this really exemplifies how a lot of immigrants think. You know, she could have said, oh, I'm Black and I'm a victim, and, you know, I can never be successful and all that. She had the total opposite mentality. And she not only opened a medical office, but in the same building, she opened up a Jamaican restaurant that I went to for 20, 30 years. And she just wouldn't take no for an answer. And I thought, there's something about immigrants where they're to go to another country where, like I said, where people that they don't look like you, they might not be the same religion, they might not speak the same languages, and say, I'm going to be a success. I think that takes a special kind of person. And I think it's really complimentary of the United States that people want to come here. And it's a reason why we're the biggest economy in the world.
All right, Mike, go ahead.
I don't want to downplay the level of oppression, especially the oppression and the holding back that a lot of African Americans experience in this country. I have a strong Irish ancestry, and coming to America was an eye-opener to me, because growing up in a poor part of the UK, I experienced oppression. And I think it might have had something to do with the fact that my ancestors were Irish. They settled in the north of England. But I was told, and all my schoolmates, that we were all failures, that we would never be able to advance any further than working on a construction site as a laborer or in a factory. So forget about going to college. We all left school age 14, 15, with no chance of any further education. I kind of was fortunate enough to get some trade union scholarships and make some advances, but it was a very hard thing to do. So when I came to America, I was in a state of shock. And one of the cultural things that I noticed, I didn't feel oppressed. I didn't feel as kept down as much. So I came with, because I'd learned survival skills. And I think you have to, in order to survive in an oppressive class-based society, you know, or where you're kept in an oppressive society, you learn these skills. You know you have potential. You know you have abilities. When the society is saying, no, we're not going to let those people advance, and then come to a country like America, it's like, I thought, wow, I didn't have that experience here. It was like, I felt free, but I knew that other people here were definitely being oppressed. I knew that, but I personally was free of the experience of oppression. So in a sense, you know, I'd like more people in America to have that same sense of freedom, that they can express their full potential as human beings.
Nikki, did President Kennedy ever influence you in any way?
Oh, well, President Kennedy, actually, he influenced my family. My father, he got my brother baptized and gave him the name John Kennedy, because it meant so much to him.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that, you know, Kennedy was kind of at that Irish ancestry, and he saw Kennedy as a great liberal, progressive president.
Great leader. Yeah.
And so he was just taken with that. And he also was in the Second World War. And he was assigned, he was in the Navy, but he was assigned to bring American soldiers out of the Japanese prisoner of war camps. And he said they were emasculated. And he asked them, how on earth do you guys manage to survive this? How come you just didn't give up and die? And he told me that the majority of them said, because they were Americans and they wanted to live out their lives in freedom. It stuck with him, that message, all his life. So he had a lot of deep respect for America, and especially for Kennedy.
Right.
Matt, did you have some comments you wanted to make?
No, it was more of a, I don't know, technical point. I'm not going to worry about it.
Witek, did you have your hand raised? Okay, any other questions at all for Carl or comments?
Oh, I also have another question too. I know in the EU that there's something called the Schengen area, where you essentially have what some would call open borders or free migration. Do you think this is at all possible, or is this even an ideal worth going for, having free migration? Because a lot of the people, including you, fight against the idea that immigration is something bad or needs to be not just like what kind of immigration needs to be controlled, but that the idea of immigration has to be controlled, or they have to always stay in their own country. That some would also go the further step and say, why are we letting I guess what Dominic or Dominic has said about give me our huddled masses, our poor, let freedom come to these people, or let these people come in the name of freedom. And as you were thinking, that people have been shut down because the recent anti-immigrant crackdowns that have been happening since the or at least the anti-immigration crackdowns for about last 20-30 years. Some people say we should be more like the EU, or be more like what we were starting with NAFTA, and go beyond that and have free migration of both capital and goods, and also of labor. But some leftists also would say this can be used to shortchange people, and it's also fed into this kind of populist notion between welfare states and open borders. Do you think there is really a contradiction, or really a struggle between having something like the Schengen area and having, say, a welfare state? And is it something to look forward, dissolving maybe not all like national borders, but at least individual borders, and having only checkpoints to stop criminals, and giving anyone who wants it, as long as they pass immigration status, if not some sort of permanent residency. Do you think that makes sense, or would it simply crowd the market, as some would say has happened in Toronto with the housing market?
Well, okay. I think if we did have open borders, we would have hundreds of millions of people, coming into the United States. I always say immigration is the sincerest form of flattery. People all over the world would like to come to the U.S. So I'm looking at the situation in a very practical way. I mean, like I said, the Senator Cotton and so on, they would like to cut immigration to the U.S. in half. They'd like to reduce immigration to the U.S. So I see Congress not taking any steps to increase, even by a little bit, immigration. So, as a practical matter, I would just like to see a system that's based more on merit and skills than on just being a family member, you know, a brother or sister of somebody in the United States. And you know, as I said, I was a student in Britain, and I remember, you know, they had a lot of pushback because they had workers coming from countries like Poland into the UK and so on. And I think some of that, you know, made Brexit possible, and Britain got out of the Schengen and out of the EU. So, you know, I'm looking at it in a more, I think, practical, incremental place. Like, could we? Dominique even said about the lottery. You know, we give 50,000 green cards a year to people just randomly in a lottery. Why can't we take those 50,000 and try to ease the backlog a little in the employment categories? And the brother-sister category, like, you know, my wife from the Philippines, if she applies for a brother or sister, it would take over 20 years, and they wouldn't be able to bring their kids with them because they'd be grown up. And some of her brothers and sisters are wonderful people who would bring a lot to the US, and some are not. And so I would probably get rid of some of the family categories and use those for employment-based green cards and investor-based green cards, people that are definitely going to improve job opportunities for Americans, healthcare of Americans, and other things.
Matt, you had a question?
Yeah, more of a comment and statement, and just kind of thinking about the Schengen area, and I think a lot of the conversation that's been happening right now about in you know, the past couple comments. I think it's important to recognize that immigration, since, you know, Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, you know, has always been derided as, you know, as something where it's, you know, taking a resource from people, but that's not actually the case, and it's never been shown to be the case. And so, like, we have to acknowledge the fact that immigrants, when they come to the country, can you know, can not only add to the existing economy, but you know, create new economies and new communities. And you know, it's not a burden. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there.
Okay.
I don't think it's a burden. It just highlights the cracks in the system for homegrown Americans. And that discrepancy, I feel like, is what is at the heart of immigration, because policies, like, Carl, so you were a immigration attorney. You know about the law, and I'm sure you're aware of, like, what's on the television, where we're seeing, like, boatloads of people cross the border, but yet Congress says that, you know, it's like you said, they said that they're cutting it in half. How are those opposite things true at the same time? How is it that we have so many people coming in, but yet an administration that is, well, not this one, because he does not care, but previous administrations have said that, you know, they want less people, but it pretty much doesn't matter what they say, because, like, people still come in droves. So how are two false things true? Or two, like, you know what I mean? Like, you obviously see people coming in, but yet you're saying, and you're you know, acting like you're putting in place these things to deter people from coming in, but it doesn't work.
You know why it doesn't work, if I may add? Because we hire them. You don't want them to come and send employers to prison.
We have a question here from Ava. Do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, you know, this conversation about, like, training Americans, and like in the case of H-1B visas, bringing skilled, qualified people in. Like, I don't feel like they need to be mutually exclusive, but again, seeing in the tech industry, we don't produce enough people with proper education because we're not given the opportunities. And yes, of course, you could work 50, 60 hours a week and, go to school, go to college if you were, I guess, had the privilege to go to a decent high school. I've certainly seen people that have gone to really poor grade schools and then were not able to get into college. But there is an abuse there. I mean, not always, but there can be an abuse of H-1B visas, right? And I think that we can both love immigration and honor the immigrant story and understand that it is a part of our identity, and that I mean, it is also an outreach internationally. There's so many benefits to immigration. As you said, they create jobs, but then also when it comes to skilled labor, like for the H-1B visas, also, like, I think that we should talk about and think about the fact that, we do have plenty of Americans that we're not training. Why is it that we're having to bring in talent that is educated outside of the country when people don't have that opportunity within this country? So I don't think that they need to be opposing each other. I think that they're questions that kind of complement each other. And I kind of bring in my mind an idea of, like, how could you, if you're trying to push I mean, I guess not in the case of H-1B visas, but pro-immigration laws, and sort of couple that with the sentiment that people here are not getting, their opportunities. I've certainly met people from Europe that don't have to work 60 hours a week while trying to obtain their degree. They don't have to go into copious amounts of debt. They had proper grade school, right? So, I mean, I don't think that we should just ignore that sentiment either, but it doesn't have to. Also, it doesn't necessarily have to go against immigration. So I just guess I wanted to make that point.
Ava, that was great. I feel like you've been listening and like processing both sides, and that was a very, very elegant way of expressing the issues. Because yeah, like I just want people here to do well. I want people here to like come first. It doesn't mean that I don't want other people here. We all got here somehow, but I want what people say about America to be true. I want our education system to be where it needs to be, so everybody has a fair chance. Yeah, it's just more about being fair than, it seems like it's like picking a favorite when somebody's already here, somebody's already gone through the system, but not given the opportunity, throughout their education to fully develop like other people in other countries. And it's because it sounds like their school systems are better. So my aggravation comes from, why aren't our school systems better? Why do we have a lack of teachers? Why aren't the teachers happy? Why are we overworking our doctors? Like, it just points to, for me, immigration just points to issues that we have here in America for Americans.
I got to raise a question here for you, Dominique, because part of the problem with immigration for America is it's the politics and the foreign policy of unintended consequences that, America, put sanctions on certain South American countries, which means those governments then have to cut back, and then people start to suffer. And so they tend to look to America as the place to go to. And then you had the crisis in the Middle East with the bombing of Iraq and Libya. And then we've got all these problems with climate refugees now. So in a sense, America's foreign policy is contributing to some of the issues that surround immigration. When you see large influxes of immigrants demanding to come here, They're coming. I mean, I would think many of them are saying, you know, I've been suffering from wars, from famine, and America then has that moral responsibility, and so do other Western countries, to be able to say, we'll take you in, you know?
Right, we create our own problems, and that's what my boyfriend said. He said, or just like, you know, it's unfortunate, like a stereotypical thing to hear that foreigners come over just to get an education and take it back to their home. And in that case, you know, just like investing, America is, you're gaining all of these skills and abilities, and it just seems like if you're planning to go, like, there should be a guarantee for people that want to leave immediately after they've, because they say that they want to take all their knowledge back home, is because America did them dirty at some point. At some point, America got involved with their politics and their government. Now there's bad blood, or there was bad blood, and people from the after generations come over here and they take up our resources, like benefits and highly paid positions, just to take it away. So maybe, like, you know, sometimes like when there's an investment in property, like an opportunity zone, it's a area that's been zoned for people to get together and invest in it and build it up, and you get your return in like 10 years. So maybe something like that. If you come here and you're not planning on staying, like if you say on your application, oh, I'm only here for the education, are you planning on staying here? Like, oh no, not really, I'm gonna go back home. Like, that should lock them into a definite like 10-20 year contract with America for us to get something back from that investment. I don't think it's fair for people just to come in, use our resources, take up a spot that an American could take, and then just dip out.
We have a last comment here from Mike. We have to be off at 8 o'clock. I'm sorry. Mike, you have something you wanted to say?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I don't think that what Dominique was suggesting is feasible. You know, first of all, how are you going to enforce that kind of thing if somebody says, okay, well, I want to go back to my country now? You're going to hold them prisoner? The other
Well,
thing
maybe we
is,
can guarantee, like,
well,
when the host was saying, like, people want to come here for a long time. So just to secure that,
well, people could say that they want to be here for a
right?
long time and maybe they don't mean it. On the other hand, somebody being honest can say, well, I only want to come here to get my college degree. And boom, they decide that they like it here, or they meet someone and get married, or this or that. On top of that, there's a lot of programs where American institutions, universities, or whatnot, actually want to bring in foreign students to teach them how to grow food in their respective countries, this and that. They want them to go back and share that knowledge. And also, there's a lot of types of financial aid which are not available to foreign students. So unless they get some kind of special scholarship or something, they have to pay, and they pay full tuition. And that in turn helps support some students, like how I was, you know, getting financial aid when I was in school, putting myself through school. I think that you don't really have a good picture of really what's going on in total. You know, you can look for one specific case of anything you're looking for, but when you're looking for the majority of what's going on, I don't think you have a balanced view. I'm sorry.
Oh, don't be sorry. That's what we're here for.
Thanks.
Well, look, I want to thank everyone. Carl, thank you for putting up with our conversation. It's something we always do. It's an open forum. We have different opinions. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. We respect that. And we appreciate you being here and explaining some background on immigration. It was so important for all of us to hear what you had to say.
Thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Fine.